You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we have what seems like a pretty explosive confession in real time by Donald Trump. I want to direct your attention to this clip.
Whoever heard you get indicted for interfering with a presidential election where you have every right to do it? You get indicted and your poll numbers go up. When people get indicted, your poll numbers go down.
Whoever heard you get indicted for interfering with the presidential election when you have every right to do it? That's what Donald Trump just said in a public interview. So first of all, what is going to be the response from Jack Smith to hearing Donald Trump effectively confess out loud that he did indeed interfere in the election?
You know, Brian, from a prosecutor's perspective, Donald Trump's mouth is the gift that keeps on giving. Everything that tumbles out of his mouth is what's called a statement of a party opponent. What does that mean? It means it can all be introduced as evidence against him at trial. And when he says, you know, I interfered in an election and I got indicted and my poll numbers went up, that is an admission. I interfered in an election. And here is the beauty of the rules of evidence. I don't want to turn this into a legal breakdown criminal law class. But when Jack Smith goes to trial against Donald Trump, he is going to be able to choose from everything Donald Trump has ever said that he did. And he's going to be able to selectively introduce statements of a party opponent of Donald Trump, for instance, on camera saying he interfered in an election. And here is the beauty of the rules of evidence, Brian. Donald Trump's lawyers can't put witnesses on to say, well, wait a minute, what Donald Trump meant by that was, and try to explain it away. Why? Because that would be hearsay. The only person who will have a right to take the stand and explain what he meant when he told an interviewer he interfered in an election is Donald Trump. And then he gets cross-examined back into the Stone Age by Jack Smith's prosecutors. Donald Trump cannot take the stand in his own defense. So that literally gives Jack Smith this buffet of incriminating statements that Donald Trump has been saying for years now to present to a jury and convict him. You know, the only impediment to getting Donald Trump convicted for his felony crimes of trying to, overturn the results of a presidential election is getting the damn case into trial, getting it tried before 12 people sitting in that wooden box in that federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. And then the proof, the evidence is going to be overwhelming.
So just to clarify here, did Trump basically screw himself because the only way he would be able to defend his comments is if he himself took the stand, and if he himself takes a stand, then he opens himself up to a bloodbath, basically, at the hands of prosecutors who would finally have the opportunity to question him in a venue where he wouldn't be allowed to lie in the same way that he does it so freely in the public.
Exactly. That's what the rules of evidence provide, and that's what Donald Trump never takes into account. He is forever trying his case in the court of public opinion, where there are no rules of evidence, no rules of law. The Constitution doesn't control. But once the case moves into court proper, Jack Smith can call a witness or can just press play on a videotape where Donald Trump says, yeah, I interfered in an election and my poll numbers went up. Well, at its core, that is an incriminating statement because you admitted you interfered in an election. But Donald Trump is not permitted to present evidence that would contradict that coming from any other source, not another witness. And here's the other thing, Brian. Donald Trump's defense attorneys can't say, well, you know what? On another occasion, Donald Trump gave an interview where he said he didn't interfere in an election. I want to play that tape for the jury. And the judge says, denied. A defendant can't play his own out-of-court statements for the jury. Only the prosecution, because it's a statement of a party opponent, only the prosecution can play Donald Trump, the defendant's audio-taped or videotaped statements. So Donald Trump is forcing himself to take the stand in the event he wants to try to explain it away. Let me give our viewers another circumstance to highlight what's going on here. Donald Trump took a whole bunch of documents when he left the White House, when he left the presidency, and we don't know who packed up those boxes. Now, we can assume Donald Trump didn't pack them up and carry the boxes to the plane himself. So Jack Smith in the Florida prosecution would have to prove Donald Trump knew or authorized each one of those documents to be taken. That would have been a pretty challenging proposition for Jack Smith to prove. But once Donald Trump started running his mouth publicly, saying, "You're darn right I took those documents, I had every right to," that just did away with the need to call lots of witnesses about who packed up the documents, because Donald Trump admitted it. Donald Trump is his own worst enemy, and Donald Trump will be the most compelling, incriminating witness against Donald Trump at trial.
Glenn, I do want to point your attention to one part of the quote that he made where he tries to qualify what he said. He says, whoever heard you get indicted for interfering with a presidential election where you have every right to do it. Does the fact that he tries to couch his language in some exonerating factor here, does that have any impact?
It will be played for the jury. There's something called the rule of completeness, where you can't just take 4 of the words a defendant utters in an interview and cut out the next 4 words, for example. But Jack Smith will be able to say, yeah, when Donald Trump said I have every right to do this, or I have every right to do that, or I can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, you, ladies and gentlemen, know that's untrue. The judge will instruct you on the law. Nobody has a right to interfere in a presidential election, but Donald Trump admitted that he did it. But you can discount, in fact, you can just disregard his follow-up claim that I had every right to commit these crimes, because you, ladies and gentlemen, know he didn't, and you are the ones who will decide whether he has a right to interfere in a presidential election or not, and you already know the answer to that question. The other thing, Brian, we know Jack Smith has been in the grand jury recently. How do we know that? Well, he just returned a new indictment against Donald Trump, what's called a superseding or subsequent indictment in the D.C. election subversion case. And he said he went back before a brand new grand jury to obtain that indictment. I'll tell you, if it were me, I would be in the grand jury early and often, continuing to present this evidence of Donald Trump's admissions of guilt. I would continue to investigate the case with a view toward perhaps issuing yet another superseding indictment, which I will tell our viewers is not unusual. It's not unusual for prosecutors to issue an original indictment, and then as the evidence of additional crimes and perhaps additional co-defendants continues to develop, we continue to go in the grand jury and we issue a series of superseding indictments until we've got all of the crimes indicted, all of the co-conspirators indicted, and that's when we're in the chute for trial.
Glenn, can you talk about the strategy that Donald Trump is trying to employ, and that he employs often, where he basically admits to a crime but figures that if he does it out loud in broad daylight that it'll seem less criminal? And so in this instance here, he says, of course I interfered with the presidential election, but I had every right to do it, assuming that if he just says it on national television, then people watching will think, well, if he's saying this out loud, then surely it can't be that illegal, because what dummy would actually admit to his crimes out loud? Can you talk about that strategy?
You know, I think, Brian, to the extent Donald Trump ever has a strategy behind anything he does, he may have 2 goals here. When he stands up and starts admitting to things that sound like crimes, like, sure, I interfered in the election, but I had a right to do it, it kind of gives rational, fact-based human beings pause, right? Because we think to ourselves, well, if it was truly criminal, you'd have to be a complete fool to stand up and admit to it. And so I think Donald Trump is a complete fool. Indeed, I think he's an imbecile when you get right down to it. But I think one of his goals might be to plant the seed of doubt in the minds of the public that, well, if he's saying it publicly, maybe it's not criminal, or maybe he really thought he wasn't doing anything wrong. So he's playing to the court of public opinion there. And I think he's also playing to the court of public opinion, hoping that if he can continue to fool enough people and get those people to vote for him in the upcoming election, then if he becomes president again, he knows he can completely do away with all of his criminal cases, certainly federally, and probably the state prosecutions as well. He might not be able to do it legitimately, but he will do it illegitimately. So I think those are both of his goals, but neither one really accounts for how these statements are going to play in a court of law versus how they're going to play in the court of public opinion.
Well, ultimately, at the end of the day, the one that we focus on here is the court of law, and that's really the one that's going to matter in all of this. So, of course, for those watching right now, if you want to follow along with everything that happens here, including the possibility now of a subsequent superseding indictment against Donald Trump, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.